This episode of New Politics was released on the 22nd of March, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
A big hello to you, David. I've actually been criticised for not saying hello to our audience over the past few months, so a big hello to our audience, and it's been very remiss of me to forget this because without our audience there's no podcast, and if there's no podcast, David, well, life is just not very interesting at all.
It's one of the highlights of my week, doing the podcast, and I'm forever conscious of the audience. If I don't express that enough, I apologise and say to all of you, you are deeply appreciated, even those who disagree, even those who are listening in to find something to disagree with, you're appreciated. And of course, those who do broadly agree with us are deeply appreciated too.
And there's lots of issues that we will be discussing today. We're talking about the lead up to the budget announcement next week, AUKUS yet again, the influences on the Liberal Party in the lead up to the next election, and a special mention to Gina Rinehart. Hope you're listening in today. There's also talk about a referendum on national security issues. We'll be discussing that as well. And we've also got an interview with Purple Pingers. He's running for the Senate and coming on to talk about housing issues and socialism. So once again, David, an action-packed episode coming up.
And I can't wait.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
And we are going through a bit of a quiet period in politics. Next week, the federal budget will be held, and there's been a bit of noise and doom and gloom about the size of the deficit, as if a deficit will be the end of the world. And we always have to apply that old classic rule of political analysis in the mainstream media. Surpluses when there's a Labor government is always because of good luck, and deficits are a sign of terrible economic management. And it's the reverse when there's a Liberal government. Deficits are always because of terrible bad luck, and surpluses are because of their supposedly superior economic management, even though the evidence doesn't suggest that. And the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, seems to be preparing the public for this, already announcing that there will be a deficit budget and outlining some of the reasons for this.
Oh, there won't be a surplus this year. I think that's pretty clear from the budget we'll hand down next week. There have been two surpluses for the first time in almost 2 decades. As you know, we've engineered the biggest ever nominal improvement in the budget, around $200 billion. We're paying down Liberal debt. We're saving on interest costs. So we've made a lot of progress in the budget. And even if you think about the deficit for this year, it will still be a deficit, but it will be much lower than what it was when what we inherited from our predecessors. And so we're making progress, even where we've been able to, in 2 years, we've been able to turn big Liberal deficits into Labor surpluses. This year, we've been able to turn a big Liberal deficit into a smaller deficit. And that will be demonstration really of our responsible economic management and the progress we're making together as Australians in the budget, but also in the economy more broadly.
It's not going to stop the media from running with these negative headlines, and it doesn't really matter if the economic circumstances are good or not. They'll always run with a negative slant on these issues. But the economy just always has to be run in the interests of the community and as many people as possible as well. And that's what the test of the budget announcement next week has to be, I think.
You can sell a deficit budget. It's rarely a good idea to run a deficit just before an election. But in this case, I don't know that it's going to make much difference to the election. The press, of course, and the Liberal Party and the National Party are going to run very hard on, oh, look at this is poor economic management. But we've gone through 9 years of coalition economic management, and people remember that. So that Jim Chalmers, at least on the face of it, responsible and fiscally sound budget, ending up in an affordable deficit, by the way. The deficit's not unmanageable. We're not about to be running into a period of mega inflation where you need to take wheelbarrows full of cash down to buy a litre of milk or anything like that. But it's a deficit that's patching a few holes, that's correcting some problems in the spending, and been trying his best to be responsible. Of course, you've got the big black hole of that money going to AUKUS. I can hear all your eyeballs rolling. Here he goes again. But we've got to get out of that deal. It's just garbage. We've got an education system that is in dire need of massive reform, particularly, but not only the tertiary level. Now, the federal government doesn't really have a lot of jurisdiction over this, but they do have the jurisdiction to allocate funds to the states to fix it. And of course, they do have jurisdiction over a lot of tertiary education. The Cyclone Alfred wasn't... it was expensive. $1.4 billion is not to be sneezed at. But that's something you have to do. That is absolutely something a government should help fix. Not just the damage on the day, but the follow-up, the healthcare, the rebuilding. And so even though it looks like a lot of money in the scheme of things, it's nothing. And you don't want to be Donald Trump saying to the Puerto Ricans, oh, you blew a hole in our budget. Or saying to the Ukrainians, you haven't thanked us for the aid we gave you. It's money that you give over to the people who need it and know how to use it, and then you make sure that it's being used properly. Jim Chalmers is head and shoulders above the last 5 or 6 treasurers. Even if we think he could be doing better, he at least has a concept of the practice of economics, and he's not just shoveling money to his mates and his donors. There is a sense there. And we can argue about whether the priorities are right or wrong, but there is a sense there in that he's trying to give the right money to the right people at the right time for the right reasons. Not all this is going to be correct either.
Oh, well, I guess that's the nature of budgets as well. But I've noticed
that's the nature of budgets.
Yeah, that's right. But I think budgets tend to end up being big media events, and the build-up for me to this year's budget just doesn't seem to be the same. It's just happening next week, but we just haven't had the same sort of hoo-ha about it. But, maybe there's a realisation that it doesn't really matter what the budget is. It's pretty much going to be talked about for a day or two, mainly by the media, and then it's going to be forgotten about. And even less so for the budget reply, which ends up being delivered on a Thursday night by the Leader of the Opposition. And that's also the night of late night shopping in many parts of Australia. The football season has also started, David, so there's people watching Thursday night football as well. That's not everyone, of course, but there's a lot of people. So it might also be a case where there's probably not that much else for the media to report on at the moment. There's been a drip feed of different funding measures over the past couple of months, an increase of funding for Medicare, funding for public schools in New South Wales, additional funding for early education and childcare, and they're trying to work towards a universal access system there. There's been funding for metal manufacturers, Whyalla Steelworks, a few $1 billion for roads in Victoria. And I think because there's been a constant drip feed, it's hard to remember whether these are old announcements that are just being re-announced, and that was an old trick that was constantly used by the Morrison government, or whether these announcements are totally new. But the budget next week will try and consolidate all of these announcements and put them into a package that the government hopes can then be used to get them re-elected.
Yeah, and I did say the other week that extra funding to Medicare is Labor heartblood. It's what Labor should be doing, and in such a way that it's very hard for any succeeding Liberal government or any non-ideologically aligned government to cut it out. I think extra funding to New South Wales schools is really good. The school system is, I think, struggling in many ways, and this is nationwide, and this is not the fault of teachers, and it's not really the fault of the administrators either. It's the education system was set up during the Industrial Revolution and works within those parameters. We're now in a post-industrial economy and a post-industrial world, so schooling needs to be rethought in a fairly radical and major way. I'm all in favour, by the way, of public schooling. I think we can take the model, we just have to change the workings of the model. And I think we can do it without major job losses, or I think we've got to think about what is it we teach, why do we teach, and how do we teach it, rather than thinking, well, we've done it since 1856 or 1854. Why should we change? And there's a lot of tinkering at the edges, and they keep changing curricula, things like that. But I think there's a fundamental change that will happen. Health too. Health is a little bit more nimble, mainly because it has to be. We get all kinds of new diseases and new challenges and new cures and new treatments, etc. So health has to be a little bit more nimble in its approach to things, although its administration could probably be updated to a much more 21st century model. And again, it's not to blame the health professionals or the doctors or the administrators. It's when you're thrown into a system that does kind of work, you work within that system.
And things can always be improved. Things can always be better. And I guess that's what a federal government's objectives are.
Yeah, I think so. And that's to be encouraged and applauded.
And also, during this time that the government has been making a lot of announcements, it's not as though they're on their own. The coalition has also been trying to keep itself relevant and make their own announcements as well. And they've been trumpeting their own version of events. And the big trumpet was being played by the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, who claimed that every Australian is paying $3,500 more in tax than when they did in 2021. And that's conveniently the last time that the coalition was in government. And I've looked up this figure or this announcement a few times, David, and there's absolutely no evidence of where this figure came from or how it was made up. You know, there was just a reference that it's analysis of information from the Parliamentary Budget Office, but there's just no other details about this. And it might have been analysis on the back of a bus ticket by Angus Taylor down at a local cafe in Canberra or Goulburn, which is where he comes from, but he might have thought, well, $10,000, that might seem like it's a little bit too much. $1,000 doesn't sound like very much, so let's go for $3,500 more in tax. That sounds a little bit more believable. And David, I realise that being in opposition is really, really, really hard work, but you just have to do a lot more than pull out some random figure and hope for the best, or just keep saying that the economy is collapsing and that it's a huge catastrophe, which is what the coalition has been ramping up pretty much all week. And for me, it's like a combination of Chicken Little and The Boy Who Cried Wolf. You know, no one believes the story because it's all so implausible. And this is a theme that we've talked about for much of this year, that in politics, your stories or your narrative just have to match up with the reality. And if the narrative that you run with is all just doom and gloom and it's just so over the top, well, no one's going to believe you, irrespective of how loudly you shout out your own narrative.
It's got to match people's perception, but it also has to be based in truth. I mean, I wonder, and given Angus Taylor's historical competence on this stuff, I wonder if the extra $3,500 per person is because of GST, because people are spending more, because the economy is much better. I don't really think it's that case, but it wouldn't surprise me if he just found that figure and not actually analysed that the GST is a tax that is reliant on spending, and the more you spend, the bigger the amount you pay. Not the more you pay proportionally, but the bigger amount you pay. Given Angus Taylor's strange lack of competence, it wouldn't surprise me if it was that. It's very hard to make up figures and have them taken at face value now, because you're a Google search away from being corrected. And mistakes are fine. We all make mistakes. We all, and they can be corrected. But this is something that he just hopes that unengaged part of the audience will sort of be, we're paying $3,500 more in tax. The trouble is if people realise that they're not, he becomes exactly what you don't want to be in politics: a blowhard, a dickhead, a fool, an incompetent. So he better hope that there's enough people out there who just happen to be paying $3,500 more in income tax or in sales tax or in capital gains tax or whatever.
Well, it could be all of these different figures. It could be even tax to GDP ratio or something like that.
Yeah. And again, most of them end up being good news. A financial advisor many years ago, we were looking at something and I asked him about the tax implications, and he said, don't worry, if you're paying tax, you're making money. We'll worry about the tax when you start to pay it. And I actually thought that was great advice. Instead of removing the tax at the get-go, see if it's worth reducing when you've made the money and if you can reduce it legally. Because if you're paying tax, you're making money. And yeah, nobody really likes paying tax, I suppose. But if you're paying more tax, it generally means there's more money in your pocket. So Angus Taylor needs to be very careful with how he frames these arguments.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
And there's more prominence being given to the debate about the AUKUS agreement, and this follows on from the instability that is being caused by the new Republican regime in the United States. And the Trump administration is now just getting back to its form from its first term back in 2017 to 2021, where there was a new drama every single day of the week. Here's the leader of the Australian Greens, Adam Bandt, talking about this issue during the week.
Look, I think the priority at the moment should be to end AUKUS, to end the AUKUS agreement. We do have a long-standing position about those other facilities, but right now, look, the Prime Minister and the government just gave Donald Trump the best part of $1 billion just in the last couple of weeks for submarines that may never arrive. And what's happened in return? We've got tariffs imposed on us and now the threat of more. That is something we could concretely do right now. Instead of spending hundreds of billions of dollars on submarines that may never arrive, but let's put Australia's interest first. What we're going to need to do is ensure that public money is being spent on the defence of Australia and that we've got a defence force that is fit for purpose. Now, over $300 billion being spent on nuclear submarines where we're thoroughly reliant on the United States, not only for the delivery of them, but then for the running of them and how they get deployed. At the moment, like Labor and Liberal have made that the centrepiece of the defence strategy. There's better things that money could be spent on, and what we need is a defence force that is fit for purpose for defence, not being an offshoot of Donald Trump's military adventurism.
And it's not just Adam Bandt saying this. We've been talking about this for some time now, maybe over the past 2 years. And here's what the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull had to say about this.
The most likely outcome of the AUKUS Pillar 1 is that we will end up with no submarines of our own. There will be Australian sailors serving on US submarines, US flagged submarines, and we'll provide them with a base in Western Australia. So we will have lost both sovereignty and security and a lot of money as well. So that's why I say it is a really bad deal. So people say, will Donald Trump like it? Well, of course he'd like it. It's such a bad deal for us. His only thing in the back of his mind, he'll be thinking, who are these dumb guys that agreed to this deal?
And this is dovetailing into a wide range of other issues that relate to the alliance with the United States and other issues that are being created by the United States. Inflation issues going up slightly, not just in Australia, but all around the world, economic growth, national security for Australia as well. And it has been a case where both major parties have tried to play down the AUKUS debate and the relationship with the United States, but the influence of United States politics and Donald Trump, it is going to play a part in the next election. I don't really know how much, but I do feel that it's going to play a part in the next election one way or another.
When we look at, I said it earlier, when we look at budget deficits and surpluses, $328 billion over 40 years.
Oh, David, it's even more. It's $368 billion.
There you go. Sorry, that $40 billion was my consultant's fees. $360 billion, even over 40 years, is still a lot of money. And it's money that could be going to health, education, law and order, infrastructure.
Abolishing HECS.
Yeah, abolishing HECS. 2 years of that and people can relax about their university degrees and go and do degrees that they're suited to and that they want to do. How many kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds aren't getting into law and medicine and teaching because they can't afford it. Not because they're not good at it, not because they don't have an aptitude and a passion and a love for it, but because they just can't afford it. And there we have the coalition's view of universities. Playgrounds for the wealthy, not modern educational tools to equip society better for being a better society. And of course, when I speak of university too, doing a general arts or general science degree, which doesn't have a, quote, real job, end quote, trademark, copyright at the end, doesn't lessen the value of those degrees either. We need thinkers. We need people who can critically think. We need people who have an understanding of things that aren't just how to balance books, how to do particular jobs, how to use a stethoscope. And those things are important, don't get me wrong. But we also need people who can take disparate bits of information and come to viable and reasonable and surprising conclusions from them. AUKUS is stealing this from us, thanks to a deal in which Boris Johnson wanted to get revenge on Emmanuel Macron, and Scott Morrison walked right into it. I still don't understand why the current Labor government isn't walking away from it. And when it comes to legacy, this and supporting a genocide are going to be the two big things that stop it being remembered as a good Labor government, let alone a great Labor government. But they still have time to walk away from it before we really start to feel the damage.
And we can see that the Liberal Party, maybe not the entire party, but certainly the leadership and those closely aligned to the leader, Peter Dutton, well, it seems to be aligning itself to the Trumpist Make America Great Again agenda, the MAGA agenda. And we discussed this a few weeks ago, but I think there's a few factors in play here. The first one is that it seems that Peter Dutton genuinely believes in the whole Trumpist agenda, and one of his biggest supporters and benefactors, Gina Rinehart, she is clearly a Trump supporter. She's a member of the Trumpettes, and that was a group that was supporting Donald Trump financially during the 2024 presidential election. And
it's not quite the ICATs, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's a little bit different there. And perhaps they're all in this drunken bubble over there, where they're thinking that because Donald Trump is a winner in the sense that he won the 2024 presidential election, there might be a school of thought which suggests, well, look at Donald Trump over there with all of his lies, his over-the-top behaviour, his fascist and autocratic behaviour. He won the 2024 US election based on all of that. And what if we try exactly the same tactics and we'll end up winning the federal election over here and we'll be in government pretty soon? I think that's what their school of thought must be. But Donald Trump, well, he might have won the 2024 US election, but he's quickly becoming a loser. And Australian political conditions are quite different to America. And this sort of strategy might work for some people in Australia, but overall, I just don't think that it's a winning formula at all.
It appeals to those libertarians who don't understand how the system works and who thinks that the system is somehow stopping them from becoming their full actualized Nietzschean self. Nietzsche, of course, would have laughed in their face and said, yes, that's got nothing to do with it. You're going to need a lot of this stuff to reach your actualized Übermensch. And excuse my pronunciations.
Well, Nietzsche is definitely laughing about that one.
Yes. But also, Dutton, I think, has misread the Australian populace, and there's evidence for this. When Roger Cook called J.D. Vance a knob, he got a huge cheer for it. We discussed that last week. I don't know that more people are going to agree with Dutton that these are good people with the best interests of the country at heart. And what he also seems to forget is that we can see the damage being done. It's not the 1980s where it was very hard to know what was going on in America except what they sent here. So everybody thought Ronald Reagan was a good president because that's all we got. It was only later that we realized he was a disaster of a president when the economic figures started coming through, when the damage he'd done started to be apparent and we could see it on the internet. The trouble Trump has is that he can't control the narrative internationally. Even if he's got the Trumpettes pushing him, there's enough alternate information coming out that exposes a lot of what he's been doing as being wrong. So he's nailed his colours to the wrong wall, as usual, and I'm not sure there's a vote in it for him. I think that the people who support this stuff had always supported it And Trump's not gaining supporters anywhere. He's losing them as the reality of the consequences of his presidency become more and more apparent. So I'm not quite sure what Dutton's doing, except I suppose, credit where it's due, he's being honest about what his approach will be.
And we also saw a lot of evidence of these actions in play during the week, and the classic old dog whistling standards of Conservative politicians, a bit of union bashing with the CFMEU, and the attacks by the Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash and Peter Dutton, well, they were just so over the top that I've forgotten what their points actually were. You know, they were going on about the union and the Labor government, union, Labor government, union, Labor government. They just kept on going on about it, making that obvious link, I guess. And all of this was being involved with the biggest corruption scandal in our history. And totally over the top, and I can't imagine it being any bigger than the robo-debt scandal or any of the other many scandals that occurred during the 9 years of the coalition government. But once again, the intensity of what they were saying and the rhetoric that was used was just so over the top and ultimately unbelievable. And the other news that the coalition pushed through during the week, and remembering that this is just a few days before the budget is being announced, so it might be wise for an opposition to start talking about, who knows, David, economic issues. And also remembering that the coalition keeps on saying that it's a superior economic manager, even though the evidence doesn't suggest that. Well, what do they talk about? Well, of course, they talk about holding a referendum on the deportation of criminals who hold dual nationality. And this relates to a very esoteric legal issue that is decided by the High Court, and it might be an issue that comes up with the High Court every 5 or 6 years. Here's Peter Dutton being interviewed by Natalie Barr on the Sunrise program.
The number one priority in this country, the polls say 80% of people care about, is cost of living. Can we afford hundreds of millions of dollars on another referendum?
Well, the first issue is to try and keep people safe. That's always the first responsibility. And in terms of cost of living, of course, that's our priority economically, because the government's made a number of decisions in the past 2 budgets which have really made it harder for Australians.
Yes, so
I don't think the threat of inflation has gone away.
Yeah,
you
do
can
we
walk,
spend money
you
on
can
a
walk and chew
referendum
gum.
right now when everyone can't afford their tomato sauce?
If we believe that we want to keep people safe, if you want to keep your kids safe and we want to keep kids safe in our community, then I don't think you can put a price on that. But you can deal with community safety at the same time that you can make good economic decisions.
This obviously is trying to tap into fears about national security, a bit of racism thrown in there as well. And maybe it's trying to tap into how the former Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and Immigration Minister Andrew Giles mismanaged this issue a couple of years ago. But all of this has just come out of nowhere. It's not an issue that anyone has talked about or asked about. And it's not like people in the streets are saying, oh, you know, I'm worried about cost of living issues or worried about my job, but we really need a referendum on, you know, being able to deport criminals who hold dual nationality. No one is saying that. And it just seems to be another thought bubble. Here's the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, giving his thoughts about this proposal.
Well, this is another thought bubble from Peter Dutton that hasn't made it to lunchtime. This morning you had Peter Dutton on one TV channel calling for a referendum and Michaelia Cash on another TV channel ruling it out. This has not been thought through. There is not clear where this has come from. Peter Dutton wants to talk about anything but cost of living.
And this to me suggests that the coalition and Peter Dutton are under a lot of pressure. And it might be a little bit of a pincer movement with Peter Dutton where he might be seriously worried about losing his own seat. And this type of stuff plays out very well in his own seat. And it also plays out very well in Queensland, but there's just no other seats that they can pick up really in Queensland. But all of this is going to cause problems elsewhere in other seats. And if Peter Dutton loses his own seat of Dixon, well, he just doesn't become the Prime Minister, and maybe he never had a chance anyway. But it looks like a case of the left hand not talking to the right hand within the Liberal Party, or maybe it's a lot of hands on the right just not talking to each other. Here's the journalist Laura Tingle giving her observations about this issue.
Yes, he has attached it to a broader range of issues. He's talked about people who are convicted terrorists, but he's also linked it to pedophiles and he's linked it to anti-Semitic attacks. Now, I don't know how, I'm not a lawyer, but how you would codify that is not clear to me. But would it just be something where the executive of the day decided, well, this is an issue where we think people should lose their citizenship? I'd point out that about a third of Australians have dual citizenship. So while they may not be planning any terror attacks or anything, they've got a pretty big interest in this. So his colleagues are appalled about this, not just because there's been no process in it, but because they just think that this will just go down like the proverbial cup of cold sick with voters. And once again, it also feeds into this picture that's emerged of Peter Dutton in the last couple of weeks of floating an idea. There was some talk about tax cuts that was raised yesterday and then they withdrew that. It's sounding really much like policy on the run, and that's making his colleagues very nervous.
The panic is just starting to become a lot more obvious, and it's just not a good sign for the coalition just a few weeks before the next election is going to be called.
It shows a complete lack of understanding of what citizenship is. You cannot deport a dual citizen. You can maybe strip them of citizenship based on various things, but even that's very difficult and legally fraught. And if a dual citizen breaks the law, we have processes and institutions that deal with that. Courts, prisons, police, other various administrative tribunals and stuff. And it just becomes such a nightmare. And of course, if this nonsense was to be brought in, you can bet, because the figures on other things already suggest this, that the vast majority of people who would fall under it will be from the countries that Dutton doesn't want them to be from. Now, that's partly because there's a higher proportion of people. It's not anything to do with an inherent badness in people from other countries, from wherever, whether you're from England or South Africa or Libya or Thailand or Latvia, it doesn't matter. The vast majority of people who've come over here have been tremendous citizens and tremendous members of the community and hardworking, tax-paying, law-abiding citizens. What Dutton is trying to do is dog whistle, because it doesn't occur to those who care about this stuff that dual citizenship isn't just the countries they don't like. It's also the countries they do like. And it's almost certainly that it'll be people from the countries they do like who will get deported. In the first few times, it'll be, oh, it's good to see that criminal gone. Okay, great. But after a while, when it's white English-speaking people, because again, not because they're inherently worse, but because statistically there are more of them, this whole thing will start to fall down. And of course, what about dual citizens who were born here but have taken citizenship elsewhere? I bet he hasn't thought of that. So they're maybe a dual American citizen because they moved to America when they were 25 for a couple of years and took American citizenship and kept the citizen. As usual, just hasn't thought it through. And the handful of votes he'll pick up from it will be not worth the hassle of trying to implement it.
Oh, definitely not. But it's also a case where, in the unlikely event that the Liberal and National parties do form government after the next election, this is probably going to be dumped anyway, because who wants to spend $400 million on a referendum for this rather esoteric legal issue? And sure, you could argue, well, look, instead of just this one tiny change to the Constitution, let's add all of these other things to the Constitution. Or maybe we should change the entire Constitution and just set up a new one. So you could argue that case, but he's not doing that. It's just about this particular issue. So $400 million on this sort of referendum, well, it's not going to happen anyway. And no one in their right mind would run with this sort of referendum anyway.
And yeah, it won't go through. Historically, you need bipartisan support for a referendum to get through. There's no way the Labor Party will pick it up. There's no way the Greens would pick it up. There's no way the Independents would pick it up. He just wants to spend the money because it means the money's going to something else other than, quote, dole bludgers and welfare cheats, end quote, trademark, copyright. Yeah, another thought bubble that's safely ignored and forgotten.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
wasted. Anticipate what's next. Show me your unknown water. Take me down, down.
It appears that the independents and smaller parties will play a much larger role in this next election, and this follows on from the trajectory over the past 40 years where the vote for the major political parties has dropped at every single election, and it suggests that people are looking for alternatives. And I'm just surprised that it's taken such a long time to actually reach this point, because in so many parts of society there are so many other choices available on virtually everything, but politics is still being dominated by the two-party system, and it is starting to break down in a big way. And one of the big issues within the electorate over the past few years has been housing, and I think that it's going to be one of the key issues during the upcoming election campaign. So more independence and housing is some of the issues in the next federal election.
And that's what people care about, price of housing. Even if housing was to crash 20%, it would still be unaffordable to many people trying to get in. At the mean price in Sydney of $1 million, a 20% crash would make $1 million property worth $800,000. That's not affordable. And of course, the trick is that people who bought their houses at $300,000 20 years ago don't want to see the value of their house go back down to $300,000 because one, $300,000 buys less today. That's natural economics. And two, it just doesn't make sense. You don't want to lose a lot of money on it, or call it an investment of that size. And for people who were in a fairly safe spot in their mortgage, suddenly they're in a very dangerous spot. So it's a challenge.
Oh, and it's also housing across the board. It's not just for people wanting to purchase a house, it's people wanting to live in affordable rental accommodation and protected rental accommodation as well.
Exactly. Yeah, and having a protected rent benefits everybody. It benefits the landlords. It benefits the tenants.
And also the quality of housing as well.
It benefits the quality of housing. It makes a lot of sense to have controlled rent, not market-controlled rent, which makes no sense, as we've seen. There's places around where I live where the cockroaches said, you can't expect us to live here, can you? And they're asking $500 and $600 a week. It's a big problem. If I knew the solution, I would charge the government a lot of money to implement it, but unfortunately I don't know the solution. I'm sure, though, that we have listeners out there who do have great ideas that keeps everybody more or less happy. In fact, our next guest might be just the person to give that solution.
And one of those people who might be available to help, and one of those alternatives who will be available at the next federal election, is Jordan van den Lam, also known as Purple Pingers. And he's running as a candidate in the Senate for the Victorian Socialists. Jordan is a housing advocate and set up the website shitrentals.org, where renters can share their stories about bad rental properties and dodgy landlords and real estate agents. And I caught up with him to talk about housing issues and socialism. And hello to you, Jordan. Welcome to New Politics.
Thanks for having me.
Now, housing affordability, it's been an issue in Australia maybe over the past 20 or 30 years or so, but it has become a really, really big issue over the past 3 years. There's been skyrocketing rents, not just in the cities, but in the regional areas as well. There's a lack of public housing. Homelessness has gone up. Housing prices are also unaffordable for many people. But what do you see as the root causes of this crisis, and what are the solutions that you are proposing to address some of these issues?
Yeah, I just before I answer that question, I push back that it's kind of a recent issue, especially considering Charles Darwin wrote about the large amount of new constructions completed, yet everyone's complaining about unaffordable and skyrocketing rents when he visited Sydney Cove in the late 1800s. So it's not a particularly new issue. I think it's now just starting to affect people that it didn't affect before. So yeah, I do want to make that clear. But in terms of, what's the causes, there's a lot of causes, and it all comes down to the commodification of housing. That's the problem. Capitalism, it's a symptom of capitalism. And yeah, we've just let it run rampant. Successive governments have let it run rampant, and they do not seem to want to do anything about it.
And what do you think some of the solutions could be?
Like the solutions are like we have the answers. There's been hundreds of parliamentary, Senate, various state and territory inquiries about it, and they all say the same thing: build public housing. It's the answer. That's what we've got to do. Not social housing, not affordable housing, public housing. That is the answer.
So with rental issues, so there are many renters that are struggling with rising rents, insecure leases, landlord-driven evictions. There's also inconsistent legislation across the states and territories all across Australia. And I know this probably all relates to that idea of capitalism that you mentioned before, but do you support issues such as stronger rent controls, and what other issues do you feel could improve tenant rights all across Australia? And I'm not just looking at issues about how long you can actually live in a particular place, but other issues such as the quality of housing that people live in as well.
Yeah, like even within capitalism, there are things that we can do to make the cancer a little bit less bad, and they are things like rent controls, things like adequate minimum standards that are uniform across the country instead of this little mishmash of random hodgepodge legislation that we have. But even then, like even in Victoria, we've got some of the strongest rental protections in the country, but they're not enforced. It relies on a renter to enforce them, and that is the problem because of the power imbalance that exists. So if we rely on someone in an unequal power relationship to enforce the state's legislation against someone with a lot more money and a lot more power, that's never going to end well. So yeah, like even at a bare minimum, if the state could enforce its own legislation instead of requiring a renter to do it, that would solve a couple of things. But in the meantime, even if you can have, live in a house that does meet the minimum standards, but you can't afford it, there's nothing you can do.
So you mentioned that Victoria does have some strong legislation, but why is there this reluctance for governments to enforce these strong legislations? Like strong legislation, if it's in place, well, it's ineffective if it's not enforced.
Well, I guess if they do it, they're going to piss off their donors. That's certainly one thing. We had in Victoria the minister at one point responsible for, the regulator for landlords was a landlord with 7 properties. So there's also a little cheeky little conflict of interest that they have often. But yeah, I think it comes down to a number of things. They don't want to piss off their donors, and also, they don't want to do their job. That costs money.
Well, this brings up a wide range of other issues as well, because the governments in Australia, they tend to focus on providing incentives to private developers to build more public housing once they get around to it. But this approach, to me, has largely failed to provide more affordable options. But do you feel that there needs to be some sort of new large-scale public housing program as a solution, and how could this be funded? Because I know that there's the Commonwealth States Housing Agreement in place at the moment, and the Conservatives always try and rip that up or amend it or renegotiate it or completely scrap it, which is what the Howard government tried to do all the way back in 1996. And this current federal Labor government, they did set up the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is funded through proceeds from the share market. Is this the right way of doing it, or should we be looking at other options?
Yeah, like first of all, we didn't need to do that. We already had a vehicle that could have done the exact same thing, which they could have used. But like even then, like this is a housing fund that is designed to make affordable housing rather than public housing. The only reason that there is any mention of like public housing is because the Greens fought it for quite a while, and then now Labor's like, we would have had this so much quicker if the Greens didn't fight it. And that's just not true, because we wouldn't have had any public housing built under this fund, even though it's such a tiny amount. But the answer isn't to incentivize or subsidize private developers building more and more expensive apartments and more expensive houses. It's just to literally build public housing ourselves with a public developer, get rid of the profit motive, get rid of the commodification, and just make a public builder. We used to have one. We can do it again. If Menzies can do it, I feel like a Labor government can do it.
And just on that issue of housing as a commodity, well, housing generally should just be treated as a human right rather than a commodity. It should be something that you live in either by yourself or with friends or with family, and that helps you become attached to the community rather than something that you just invest in and make profits out of. And I'm not suggesting that someone who buys a house isn't a part of the community. Of course they are, but housing over the past 20 or 30 years, or maybe even further back, as you suggested before, has become more of a process of investing rather than a place where you live and you become part of the community. So what do you feel can be done to change some of those perceptions, and what role can the federal government play in ensuring that everyone has got access to affordable and secure housing?
Yeah, from the perception kind of perspective, I think the easiest thing to do is get rid of the capital gains tax exemption and negative gearing concessions that are available to property investors. We know the effect that has in terms of, people's perception that housing is not a human right. It's in fact an investment vehicle. And it's those two specific tax policies that have really encouraged the culture of, if you've got a spare 100K lying around, you are stupid if you don't invest it in an investment property. And that's wrong. That's why we have, that's a significant reason behind the problem that we have today. So literally just scrap that immediately. We'll start to see the impacts pretty quick, particularly if we don't do the cowards, grandfathering of negative gearing or grandfathering of the capital gains tax discount. It'd help a fair bit. But really, if we do want to see the actual decommodification of housing, the only way to do that is by building public housing to a level that is such good quality and so accessible to anyone who wants it, not just, the people who are most desperate and need it the most. If we had public housing that was accessible to everyone, that would decommodify housing pretty effectively.
Now, some of those issues that you mentioned, such as modifications to the capital gains tax or even getting rid of it completely in the context of housing, the Labor Party did take that to an election back in 2019. Well, not completely, but they took reductions of capital gains tax on housing to the election campaign in 2019. Now, they lost that election, and part of the rationale that they had, I don't think it's the correct one, but part of their rationale was that, we lost that election because we took this housing policy to the election campaign in 2019 and we lost that election. So their feeling is that they're not going to revisit that for a long, long time because of the feeling that it cost them that election in 2019. But do you feel that they misread those lessons from the 2019 election?
Yeah, because they weren't the lessons from the 2019 election. They commissioned a report into their own 2019 election, and that was not what the report found. The report found that they didn't lose the election because they went, a little bit softly on negative gearing or like franking credits. Is because they did a shit job in every other respect. So yeah, that's the wrong lesson to be taking, and we know why they're taking that lesson, and it's because they have a fairly significant cohort of donors and investors and supporters from the landowning class that don't want them to.
Now, Jordan, you are a member of the Victorian Socialists, and socialism is often dismissed by the mainstream political parties in Australia, and the mainstream media often depicts anything at all to do with either socialism or Marxism or communism as the biggest threat to humanity, as if neoliberalism hasn't caused enough damage over the past 40 years or so. So there's always a scare campaign attached to this, especially if it's anything related to China. And to me, it seems that most of the people who criticise publicly or offer critiques about socialism don't seem to know very much about it. So how do you see socialist policies fitting into the current political landscape, and do you think that there is growing support for these ideas amongst voters?
Absolutely. Like we've got data to show that. People under 25, people under 35 are overwhelmingly leaning towards socialism. But yeah, there's been a pretty effective Red Scare campaign against us for quite some time. But you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't think that, banks, property developers, grocery stores, and all the monopolies, Gina Reinhart, posting windfall record profits while we all continue to struggle harder and harder wouldn't be leaning towards socialism, because the facts show we've got enough money in this country. We have plenty wealth. It's just being taken from us and given to the rich. And the answer is, we can use some of that wealth, stop spending it on, stop spending $368 billion on submarines that we'll never get, and instead build houses, increase welfare so that we're not living in poverty, increase healthcare, just do things properly, and we can fix a lot of this mess. But we won't with these two major parties, that's for sure.
So why do you think there is this resistance? Because a lot of these solutions to me seem quite straightforward, like you raise taxes on certain processes within the business, and Gina Reinhardt, for example, or Andrew Forrest. Like, I think it was in 2020 that and that was the first year of COVID, that during that time, collectively, those two enterprises made $48 billion in profits. So the solutions to me seem pretty obvious and evident, but why is there this big resistance to making these sort of changes?
Well, like a number of reasons. They have a lot of money and therefore they have a lot of power. So they're scared. The ruling class is scared of those particular members of the ruling class. But also they are those members. Like, we look at, Labor politicians own more houses, at least on their register of interest, than the Liberal politicians. And that's not because they actually probably do own more investment properties. It's probably because they haven't gotten as good at creating blind trusts and family trusts as the Liberal Party. But they are well and truly a member of that class who is benefiting from a worsening crisis, particularly when it comes to housing. So why would they? Why would they want to do this?
So you are a Senate candidate in the next federal election, and the vote for the major political parties has been dropping over the past 40 years or so, and to me that seems like it's been fast-tracked over the past 3 or 4 elections. So it's obvious that the electorate is looking for alternatives, and the overall system is still referred to as the two-party system. But what key messages do you have to bring to the voters just in general, and how do you plan to convince people that a socialist approach to housing and economic justice, as well as quite a few other issues as well, how do you convince the electorate that this is the way forward?
Yeah, well, like, it's kind of two-pronged. Like, we're not going to spend our time being like, if you vote for us, then that's all you need to do, and we'll fix everything for you. That's not how we work. That's not how we ever want to work. We ask a fair bit more of people who are amenable to our message. We want you not just to vote for us. We want you to get out in your communities, spread socialist politics in your workplaces, in your unions, in your street, and then force them to make the change. Not just beg them once every 3 years or beg them by signing a petition every now and then. That's just not good enough, because it relies on the ruling class to, give us a little crumb from their plate of capital and a little bit of goodwill. That's not enough. We need to threaten them. And we can threaten them more than once every 3 years. We can threaten them more than just every election. We can do that every day, but we need to get organised to do that. So, have a look at the policies, see if you like them. If you don't like them, get involved, come change them. And let's fight them.
Jordan Vandenlam, thanks for discussing these issues today. I think that they are very important issues to discuss, because we do need a lot of solutions to housing issues in Australia. So thanks a lot for your time, and all the best for your Senate campaign.
Thanks for having me, Eddie. Appreciate it.
And as part of the build-up to the federal election, we'll be assessing the published opinion polls on a more regular basis, and there were 2 opinion polls published during the week. The Morgan poll, which tends to favour the Labor vote more than the other pollsters, that was 54.5% for the Labor government and 45.5% for the Liberal and National parties. And in the Essential poll, it's actually even. But overall, still showing a trend towards the government. And David, we suggested a few weeks ago that things are starting to turn around for the federal government, and maybe over the past 18 months within all of these opinion polls, this whole thing about who will you vote for at the next election, well, that concept might be a little bit abstract for a lot of people, and people have been grumbling and thinking, oh, don't like Albanese, I'm going to vote for the other guy, whoever it is. But now they're starting to realise that that other guy is Peter Dutton, and they're starting to have second thoughts about that. And generally, people don't think about politics unless they have to. And of course, you and I think about politics all the time, but yes, it is an illness. We'll get around to solving that. But generally don't think about politics unless they have to. And election time is when they definitely have to start thinking about politics and definitely have to make a choice about it. And I just don't think that they're particularly attracted to whatever it is that the Liberal Party is offering. And the opinion polls that are being published right now are suggesting that.
We've been saying for a long time that Peter Dutton has very, very little chance of making it through without some kind of outside help. And the polls are reflecting this. If an election was to be held today, according to the polls, Labor would come in with an increased majority. I'm not prepared to say that, and we still don't quite know when the election is. May 17 seems not unreasonable, but I'm not calling that. But it does seem like the most reasonable and most logical date. That's a long time in politics, but it's a long time for both sides. Dutton had his I don't hold a hosemate moment when he went to Justin Hemmy's party. I think that has weakened him fatally and irreversibly. And I think down to the fact that even if he was building up a long 2 or 3 term strategy to become Prime Minister, that's gone. He'll be gone after the election unless he can win 6 or 7 or 8 seats, which up to last week I thought he might have been able to win. I don't think he can now. Even that's not enough to get anywhere near even considering minority government. But it would at least say that he's pushing the party in the right direction. The other thing too is that with a couple of major caveats, Labor has done a fairly decent job. Like Western Australia last week. I keep going back to last week. So pause this one. If you didn't hear last week's, pause this one, go back to next week and come back. I'll wait for a sec. But the Labor government has been okay. It's been disappointing. It hasn't been reformist and broad and crash enough for a lot of people. But it has done some good things and is promising to do some good things after the election, some of which we wish they'd done now, but nonetheless, there's a package there that people can accept or reject, whereas the Dutton-led Liberal Party has nothing. And I think the polls are starting to reflect that.
And we've also been asked by our audience, well, when do you think the election will be held? And it's either going to be May 17th, which is what you suggested before, David, or May the 10th. And May the 17th seems to be the most favourable. It's also the last possible date that the election can be held. And I think that's most favourable because Easter is well and truly over. All of the school holidays will be over in all states across Australia. And I think they'll all be finished their holidays by the end of April. Then there'll be a week more of campaigning, and then the pre-polling commences on May the 5th. And of course, the school holidays are not the be-all and end-all because not everyone has got school-age kids. But I just think that it's that issue about not wanting to interrupt people during any sort of holiday or period such as Easter. And for me, it doesn't really matter when the election is going to be held anyway. It will probably end up with a similar result. But the most favourable date for the government would be May 17, which means that the election would need to be called by April the 14th in just a few weeks' time.
Every disadvantage for the government in this case is also a disadvantage for the Liberal Party. I don't think it would be smart to announce a major policy on Easter Sunday, and I think it would be even less smart to criticise the government on Easter Sunday or Good Friday or Easter Monday.
Well, that's right. Everyone wants to have a sense of goodwill over Easter or during school holidays.
And I think, too, you can speak to people of different cultural backgrounds who have electoral campaigns all over their sacred and holy holidays anyway, sometimes. And you just have to live with it. So I don't think it's going to hurt in this case. Everybody knows that we have to have elections at certain points. Yeah, I think keeping out of school holidays is good because even though not everybody has children or school-age children or school-age grandchildren, I think it's also fair to say that a good proportion of the voting public do. And they'll be distracted with either going away or trying to organise daycare and vacation care for their kids and what have you. But yeah, that disadvantage also works just as much for the opposition, and given what I believe is Peter Dutton's unlikability, he will irritate more people interrupting their quieter time or their break than Anthony Albanese will. Not that Anthony Albanese will annoy nobody, of course he will, but Peter Dutton will annoy more people, I think.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.